But here to explain the report, and I think it's been almost 14 years since we adopted the funding formula. And it needed to be revisited. Other states are doing that. New York had a big analysis of how they fund public education. There's a lawsuit right now in Delaware on the funding of special ed and English language learners that's maybe ending up in court at some point. So it's an appropriate time to take a look at the formula. Just as an aside, Governor McKee is readjusting his budget based on the $233 million that the Revenue Estimating Committee provided. Once they got money, they all want to spend it right away. But $15.5 million would go to education, and primarily what they would be doing is increasing the student success factor to 45%. His current budget has it going from 40% to 43%. The proposal is to go up to 45%. Now, obviously, depending on what your profile is as a district, this would tend to benefit those communities that are more urban-centered, because that's where the majority of the poverty is identified as. So it would be a benefit to those districts. I think every district is struggling with declining enrollment. That's something that we're going to have to address as an organization as well. But without further ado, I want to introduce Brenda Santos. She's the Director of Research and Partnerships and Networks, the Rhode Island Research Partnerships and Networks. Let me just, on the side, I've been doing this for over 35 years, and in the past, the Arrenberg Institute was kind of off to the side when it came to local education issues. That's not the case now. They're very much involved. They were very much a part of, they were the driver of the Rhode Island Foundation study, and they really do partner and want to continue and expand their partnerships with local education agencies. So Brenda, we'll turn it over to you, and you're on.
Great. Thank you so much to Tim and to everyone here. Before I share a lot of information about the Blue Ribbon Commission's recommendations, I just want to say thank you. I'm a Rhode Island parent and a decades-long educator. I started as a high school social studies teacher, and I now have children in 2 different Rhode Island school districts because of interdistrict CTE, one about to graduate. So thank you. I know that the work you do is critically important and also thankless. So as Tim noted, the Blue Ribbon Commission was convened by the Rhode Island Foundation in December of 2025. The role that the Arrenberg Institute, where I work, and that's a research institute at Brown University, played was as facilitator and research partner. And I think you'll see as I share the Commission's recommendations that have really formed the basis of the 2 pieces of legislation in our legislature right now. The kind of work that Arrenberg did on this is primarily to provide a research basis so that these recommendations are grounded in the best thinking of all the stakeholders at the table, as well as best practice from other states and what the research evidence is saying about what's effective in school funding. We also literally facilitated commission meetings and brought experts in front of that group, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. It's important, though, to just note that these recommendations are the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission. They're unanimous, and they reflect the recommendations of Tim, representing your group, as well as all the other people I'm about to share with you who sat on that commission. So the Blue Ribbon Commission brought together diverse leading voices across the state with national experts for a consensus vision. It drew on national evidence and best practice to propose a plan to fund the state schools. Again, this is the 2nd iteration of the state funding formula. Rhode Island was one of the last, if not the last in the nation, to have a state funding formula, and it is over a decade old now. It has really been tweaked in ways that it doesn't really It doesn't really resemble its original version. And part of the project here in creating this newer, revised proposal for a new funding system was to help it to stand the test of time a little bit better, and you'll see provisions for that throughout. The commission is comprised of local education leaders and community partners from all the organizations that you see on the screen. There was an effort here in putting this group together. Arrenberg and the foundation worked together to assemble this group of leaders to represent all of these stakeholders who are really end users of the funding formula. So that includes parents who were represented by Parents for Leading for Educational Equity, this association, both of the teachers' unions, as well as the Rhode Island League of Charter Schools, the League of Cities and Towns to represent your municipal governments and taxpayers, young people through Young Voices, students with disabilities through Meeting Street, as well as principals and superintendents, as well as some groups with specific expertise, like the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council. So our process, we began, as I mentioned, meeting in December of 2025 with this group. The group met about monthly for roughly a year in 2-hour meetings. And one of Arrenberg's main roles was to make those meetings as productive as possible. And so we interviewed about 45 national experts, as well as some state-level finance experts as well, and culled a group of 12 that we brought to various meetings around specific topics so that the commission could have direct access and ask questions of their own of experts in particular areas like school accountability, serving students with disabilities, accounting for poverty, things like that. We also assembled 2 groups outside of the main Blue Ribbon Commission, and I'll explain why for both groups. We thought it was important to represent youth voice in this project, and so we facilitated a youth working group of 14 high school students. Some are now college students, but at that time, high school students from around the state. They represent many of your districts, urban districts, suburban districts, rural districts. A couple were from charter schools. Most were from traditional public school districts. Some were from CTE programs and were in them across district lines. We really tried to assemble a group of kids who would represent lots of perspectives. They came from 8 districts. Those students met 3 times as a group in person, and then once online to review the commission's recommendations. They added their unanimous support to the recommendations as well, and they also, leading up to that point, presented their recommendations to the Blue Ribbon Commission in a commission meeting. We also assembled an accountability working group. From the very beginning, it was clear that any additional investment in public education needed to be accompanied by accountability for outcomes and for transparency. And this is a topic that is in and of itself quite involved. We brought together 4 national experts, in this case from across the political spectrum, as well as those other kinds of groups that we've talked about already. So we had folks who had been involved in Massachusetts system, in California's system, who work for research institutes with more kind of conservative leanings, and that group met 3 times as well and informed the commission's recommendations on accountability, fiscal accountability. We're not talking about what RIDE is already doing. The commission began with a set of shared principles, values that would guide this work, and you'll see in the recommendations how these are carried forward. I also think this is helpful in seeing what kinds of problems were surfaced at the very beginning and what really motivated this work. So any funding system should be sufficient. It should fully support public education for all students. It should be student-centered, meaning that when at the basic level we think about funding students, right? We're funding students in whatever programs they're in for whatever needs they have. Should be comprehensive. This is a major problem with the current funding formula. It does not account for the full cost of education. Any system should include the broad range of costs we know are associated with district budgets. It should be predictable yet flexible. We are in a moment right now that happens every single year where the unpredictability of the state contribution to public education is causing significant material challenge locally for both school committees, local municipalities, as well as school districts. I work very closely with superintendents, and this is just the most painful part of the job. But it also needs to be flexible. You may have experienced in your district an influx of students with a particular kind of need, either multilingual learners or even a single student with significant disabilities. Those changes need to be kind of responded to, right, in the funding system. It should be transparent and timely. The opposite of all these words are the problems we have right now, right? There is a lack of transparency in the system, and the process is not timely. It doesn't match up with all of the other budget processes that are happening. There should be an equitable fiscal burden between local communities and also between local communities and the state. And of course, any investment in public education should be accompanied by accountability for fiscal responsibility, transparency, as well as outcomes. Sets of recommendations. I'm going to go through each one. The Commission's report is many, many, many pages. You can find it on the Rhode Island Foundation's website, and there's a lot of detail embedded within each of these. All of that is translated into legalese in both of the bills that Tim talked about, including the Senate bill that'll be heard on this coming Thursday. But what I'm presenting here are the Commission's recommendations, and they are reflected in those bills. The first recommendation is to account for the full cost of education in the funding system and to share those costs more equitably. The second is to tailor instructional costs to individual student needs more directly. The third is to ensure greater predictability for municipalities and for school districts with a required local share that's more kind of clearly and transparently determined, and to require transparency and strategic management that ties educational spending to outcomes. So I hope you can already see the way that these recommendations in principle reflect the values that I've just shared that we started with, and I'm going to go into a detail about the nuts and bolts and how these things would work. Before I do, I'll just reiterate that the recommendations in the proposal represent a consensus vision from the members of the Commission that I presented to you before. They are interconnected with each other, so I'm going to talk about a funding system rather than the funding formula, which is really kind of a narrow thing. And if you pull some pieces out of this system, you kind of break the system. It works together, and so we're reminding legislators of that when we are called as expert witnesses. And it aims to clarify and redistribute the cost of education, not to invent a new cost of education. And I think that's one of the things that is misrepresented in the media most frequently, because such and such more money is like a good headline rather than complicated system becomes better. That's a less noteworthy headline, but the proposal is not on its face it doesn't really say anything about amount of money. And I can go into a little bit more about that later. It's really about how numbers are determined and then how those costs are shared. Okay. So the first recommendation, again, is to account for the full cost of educating students in the funding system and to share those costs more equitably. We found that it's helpful in this part to kind of start with a little bit of framing, and I'm going to frame by just showing you what is happening today at a very high level. So these are current numbers, or estimates really. The total education spending within the state of Rhode Island right now is just over $3 billion. A little over half of that is paid for by the state of Rhode Island, $1.57 billion. And local communities fund about $1.5 billion of that. So a little more than 50. You're going to hear me say 58% a little bit later. That's because the state of Rhode Island is currently funding about 58% of the education costs. That's about middle of the road. It's not if you look across the country, it's not the most generous state contribution. It's also not the lowest. At the bottom there, you see some very estimated costs designed to give you a sense of the three categories of cost sharing that we're thinking about when thinking about who's going to pay, what are the costs and who's going to pay for them. So on the far left of the screen, you see state covered costs. These are the kinds of things that the state is contributing to through categorical funds. So not part of the funding formula, but contributions to public education by the state. That includes state contributions to high-cost special education, which I'm sure that everyone in this room knows means 4 or more times the cost of a typical student. That's around $75,000 per year now. And it's not a full coverage of the cost for those students. It's a contribution toward. It is, because it's categorical, it is subject to legislation. It's subject to the legislature's appropriation process each year, which makes it inherently unstable. And of course, there are other categorical funds in that category. In the middle, you see shared costs. That very first bullet there that says instructional costs is the current funding formula. So the current funding formula it uses a regional average to include certain categories of costs. And those costs are essentially the cost of teachers and instructional material. It's called a core instructional amount. That core instructional amount, or CIA, is that first bullet there of shared costs. And it's a narrow number. It's a narrow category of costs. It doesn't include things like teacher retirement costs that many of your districts all of your districts, right, have incurred. Some of you also have a significant legacy pension debt as well. It doesn't include out-of-district or, for that matter, in-district transportation. Those are not included in the core instructional amount. Nonetheless, some of these costs continue to be shared by the state, but again, outside of the funding formula, which means that they're shared in a way that is kind of unpredictable and unreliable. On the right-hand side, you see locally covered costs, and this is really important. There are about over $500 million right now is covered locally outside of the funding formula and pretty much entirely by local communities. That includes things like in-district transportation and building maintenance and any other local expenditures. So I'm sure everybody here has seen a school budget. It includes a lot more things than personnel is the big one, but it also includes other things besides teachers and instructional materials, and many of those costs are absorbed by local communities. So these are the three categories, and I'm sharing them with you or grounding us in this framework because I'm going to be sharing the Commission's recommendations to move costs from one category to another. Amazing to do civic work with high school students, and they, like Commission members, were just like shocked at some of the things that were not included in the school funding formula. It defies logic, right, that a school funding formula would not include the cost to transport students to the school building. And students, nothing like that gets past, no illogic like that gets past students. They urged the Blue Ribbon Commission to address this issue. They came to the group and said, even the best educational resources mean little if students can't reliably get to school. Funding busing will alleviate a burden that all schools have to pay. It is essential. It is a universal burden this commission can lift, thus improving the lives of every student in Rhode Island. And just as a reminder here, it is not included, in-district transportation is not included in the funding formula, despite the fact that 5% of Rhode Island district budgets in fiscal year 2024 were spent on in-district transportation. So what to do about it? The Commission recommends that we share the costs, that we ensure costs are shared and shift the responsibility of specific costs to the state. So 2 important things here. The first is to expand that core instructional amount to a core education amount that includes more costs. So this is really important. It's probably one of the most important changes that is recommended by the Commission. Instead of selecting out teachers, personnel and instructional materials, the commission is recommending that additional categories be included in that regional average that's used to form the basis of the funding formula. This core instructional amount, now core education amount, is the starting figure of the funding formula. It's at the most basic level what we say it costs to educate kids. Second, the commission recommends that the state take responsibility for certain specific costs. High-cost special education, legacy teacher pension debt, so not the pensions of your current teachers, but legacy debt that your district might be carrying. Out-of-district transportation and for CTE programs, charter schools, and early childhood screening. So let me say a little bit more about the logic here. These costs, many of them, hit districts in ways that are really unpredictable and have absolutely nothing to do with the children in the seat. So that principle, remember that principle of following the student and the student being the driver of this funding? We really want to literally think about what does it cost to educate this child, this child, this child that's here in the seat in my district today? These costs are largely unassociated from that question, right? High-cost special education, most typically is for students who are educated out of district. These are tuition payments to programs. Legacy teacher pension debt has absolutely nothing to do with your children in the seats today. Those are, that is just debt on a book. And it also has nothing to do with the adults in the system today. It is very old debt on the book. Yet, your system is paying for that through the funding that was intended for those children in the seats. That is where that money is coming from. Same with out-of-district transportation. You're paying tuition for those kids to go to other districts. They are not children in your seats. They're children in some other district. And so the state could absorb these costs in a way that would also remove some disincentives we have right now for doing the best for kids and getting them into programs that are the best for them. So here's another way of looking at what I just described, and hopefully you can see it. This is such a beautiful, bright room, but I hope you can still see the contrast. In those kind of green dots, you see not all the costs, but we've just given you a few examples to show what's happening here. Some costs that are currently fully locally funded are being included in that new core education amount, so they essentially become part of the funding formula. So that's true for in-district transportation, school safety, CTE costs, building maintenance. Those things are not in the funding formula today, but the proposal is that they be included by expanding the core instructional amount to a core education amount that's more comprehensive. There are also some costs today that are shared but not in the formula. Things like retirement costs for retired teachers, that legacy teacher pension debt, out of district transportation, high cost special education. The commission is recommending those costs go over to the state entirely. What that's going to do is shrink that box that was on the far right of the screen for those kind of random costs covered entirely by districts not accounted for within the school funding system. There is a ton of this information, including advocacy information, in the Rhode Island Foundation's webpage that I can share with you. It's Rhode Island Foundation Fair Funding, and there's a lot of, probably better than this stuff, information that you can use, one-pagers, two-pagers, the actual recommendations, including a shorter executive summary.
And earlier in the presentation, you said the whole Blue Ribbon report, but I missed that. Is that on Rhode Island Foundation?
Yes, yes. Yep, the full report, there's kind of like a web page with a description of it, and then you can click on the full report, which is very long, and then an executive summary, and then there are things meant for, if you're interested in advocacy, there are materials they've created for that.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
As far as the fund for, like, say we have $3 million set aside for our building maintenance fund, you're recommending that the state finance that for us.
That we're recommending that building maintenance be included within the funding formula, which means that it would be part of the base amount. So it would move out of categorical into the actual budget.
And I'm not sure if that's just being used by ride site or if it's something that
Yeah, the Arrenberg Institute had a research team on this project, and they work closely with RIDE as well as partners at other institutions that there's a different kind of data source that's used across states because we're using a regional average, and so we're using codes from that data source to determine what that core educational amount is. That's not a different that's the same process that's used now. There's just a narrower set of codes that are used. We used publicly available data in coordination with RIDE. We also Mike DeBiase was a member of the commission from RIPAC, and he and Jeff Hamill at his institution were able to help us as well.
More curious, like, it would be, for towns that maybe, already have high property taxes, I'm thinking maybe from that perspective, it would be appealing to them, but
Right.
just kind of trying to understand if there would be any negative impact to the cost.
Yeah, so the commission's objective was to create a system that was much more reflective of what it actually costs to educate kids right now. So nothing here is kind of like aspirational. It's not like it should include this thing. It's more like it does include this thing, right? It's meant to be more reflective of what the actual costs are right now. I think a premise here is that the funding formula right now underestimates what it costs to educate children, and that's why we see the problems you see at the local level. And so a more kind of transparent and accurate depiction of what those real costs are is going to be helpful in moving us forward. It's not going to solve problems that are not funding problems. So I'll put that out there. There are many people who wish that this proposal facilitated some kind of move toward regional efficiency, including regionalization. The commission, that was not the commission's job. We haven't made that problem worse. We've probably made it better in the sense that those big costs at a central level are definitely more efficient, right? Like the state will be able to negotiate contracts and negotiate bus routes. This is not just as a parent, especially of a CTE kid, it's meaningful to me not just that the state will pay for it, but that we will move toward eliminating some of these really long bus routes for kids because we won't be 40 different people trying to figure out how to get kids from point A to point B, buses passing each other to the same place. I mean, that kind of thing is happening right now. I don't see researchers have a lot of paranoia radar. Like that's how it's in my paranoia radar is pretty heightened, and I do think that this is a move in the right direction.
It's not necessarily going to increase the funding bucket, but it is going to take that funding bucket and make it more equitable throughout the districts because it's going to more accurately reflect what we actually spend.
Yes.
Okay.
Just a comment. Transportation is a killer. We are the second largest landmass in the state of Rhode Island. We have 450 road miles, and our transportation budget is, we don't have a contract right now because the transportation budget is $7 million.
Yes.
And we have rerouted buses, reorganized starting and ending times to avoid the buses passing one another, going to a two-tier system. Parents had a connection with their middle school kids on a bus with high school kids. And I kept saying, our high school kids will hopefully they're sixth graders. We have a policy on time on a bus. But it's a lot of money is going to transportation that could be going to services for the children.
Yeah. Agreed.
Just clearly that's my issue.
I just have one other question on the high-cost special education.
Yes.
When you were looking at that, were you only looking at the outplacement students that are in that right now, or were you collectively looking across the state? And I ask that because some of us in some towns have built a lower cost, highly functional special education program, which we see our costs continue to increase like tenfold every single year because
Yes.
it's so good.
So the recommendation doesn't have any stipulation that those students have to be served out of district. I mean, that's amazing that you're doing that within district. So it's the same bar for high-cost special education. Do they meet that amount of 4 times the cost of a typical student? That would be the state covered. In the next section that I'm about to go over right now, you're going to see there's also funding for special education students who don't meet the 4 times bar. There are many costs your districts are incurring from serving students with special needs who don't cost $75,000 a year, but might cost $60,000. And so that right now is not accounted for within the funding formula, and the recommendation is that it be accounted for in the funding formula. So that would hit your base amount. Yeah, so the commission's recommendation is purely about funding, not about, there's no change to who would make decisions about students' programming at all. I would say 2 things about the charter school. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. So one, the funding formula as it exists right now, in a range of ways, treats students, programs, LEAs, and taxpayers, quite candidly, differently. This funding formula strives to treat every student, every program, and every taxpayer exactly the same. And so you'll see some changes there. The other 3 things, not 2 things. The second thing I'll say is that removing things like out-of-district transportation and high-cost special education and legacy teacher pension debt removes actually the bulk of the differential costs between charter and traditional public schools. So when we look at, there's these balance sheets of differential costs that come out every year. When we look at those balance sheets of differential costs, there are 3 costs that spike. Out-of-district transportation, you all in traditional districts are covering that more than charter schools, of course. High-cost special education is a higher burden for traditional public districts. And legacy teacher pension debt, obviously, right, is a cost you're incurring that charter schools do not incur. All of those costs come off of district budgets in this proposal. They all go to the state. So I think that's one way I would answer your question. The third thing I will say is that, and I've iterated this before with a different question, the funding formula proposal doesn't solve problems that are not the funding formula. And so, and I think the biggest among them is declining enrollment. And however declining enrollment occurs, there is going to we're all going to need to continue to have that conversation and problem solve around efficiency and declining enrollment. But this proposal kind of stays out of that. I think for better as well, right? That we scoped this as a fair funding project. It doesn't solve all problems of declining enrollment, but I think it does equalize for students, LEAs, and taxpayers. So let me go further because I think I'm going to try to show you what I just said to you. The second overarching recommendation is to tailor instructional costs more directly to student needs. The Commission's proposal accounts for differential costs of educating all students. And there's kind of 2 ways that 2 kinds of recommendations the Commission's making. The first is just to increase the weight for economically disadvantaged students, or the student success factor. It's currently 40%. The Commission recommends 50%. And there's kind of a trade-off within the proposal that I can explain if that's helpful. The other factors are meant to ensure that kids who require or elect special programs that cost more money, that's accounted for, and that your districts are receiving funding that's consistent with the cost of those programs. So we often think about multilingual learners and students with disabilities as a characteristic. I want you to think of it as a program. This is about the cost, right? The student doesn't inherently cost more money, the program costs the money. So we want to think about how much is that MLL program costing? And how much does it cost for a student who's just arrived, a newcomer, versus for a student who's about to exit or just exited the program? Those students also have differential costs. But there are also many students who receive special education services that cost districts money that don't meet that 4 times. They don't meet the high cost special education bar. And I think a great asset in our state, students are taking advantage of CTE programs that cost more money. Those, we can't just ignore that. When we ignore it, everything we ignore within the real cost of education becomes your problem, right? Becomes a part of municipal responsibility. And so we want the funding formula to acknowledge when students elect these programs that they're going to cost more money. So here's what, at a basic level, what the part we think of as the funding formula would look like under this recommendation. It would begin with a core education amount. Remember that is currently called the core instructional amount. It includes the cost of teachers and instructional materials. We're proposing that becomes more broad and reflective of real costs. So things like building maintenance, school safety, in-district transportation, and the cost of your current teachers' pensions. The student success factor for economically disadvantaged students would go to 50% under this proposal, and then these instructional program factors would be layered in. This is in part to your question before. That includes accounting for the higher cost of multilingual learners, special education students, and CTE participants who are in higher cost CTE programs. So not any CTE program, but any that requires more facility cost or equipment cost, things like that. And so these changes up to this point have really attempted to treat all schools equally within the system and to remove those differential costs. So given other shifts in the funding system, the Commission is recommending an end to charter school holdbacks, which I think affects a few of your districts, as well as direct payment to charter schools rather than pass through local budgets. The position here is really similar to on some of these other issues like declining enrollment. The Commission had absolutely no interest in legislating charter schools or having that debate within our project. Our project was to fix the school funding system for all Rhode Island kids, and so we really tried to ensure that we created a system that was fair and in as much as possible impervious to the kind of political tinkering that has resulted in the brokenness of our current system. The third recommendation is to ensure greater predictability for municipalities as well as for school districts with a required local share. So under this proposal, local municipalities will pay a predictably defined local share to fund their schools. While most municipalities already meet their local share, any failure to fund local students' education impacts Rhode Island students, but also our state economy and our economic future. So Rhode Island is, I'll first say before that second bullet, Rhode Island is anomalous right now in having an optional recommended local share rather than a required one. So this would shift the state toward the norm. Rhode Island is also anomalous in determining local ability to pay using a quadratic mean. That takes into account child poverty as well as property wealth. This proposal would utilize a direct reflection of the taxable income within the taxable property, not income, property within a municipality, meaning that essentially in no matter which community you live in, if you moved from one town to another or to a city, the same burden relative to taxable income would be applied to that community. So your effective kind of tax for education doesn't change depending on where you live. So again, each municipality will pay a required local share based on assessed value of taxable residential and commercial property. Yes? That's a great question. So we did a lot of research into how is that enforced? So that's a great question. And because Rhode Island is anomalous, we have a lot of examples of how different states enforce that. There are some states that do, that fully withhold state school funding. There are some that withhold other kinds of funding. And there are some that do a kind of one-to-one withholding. So what that means, and that's closest to the Connecticut model, that's what this proposal suggests. So if a town or a city were to underfund by 5%, the state would underfund, it's a double penalty, would underfund by 10%. The rationale here, this is the economic principle here is dissuasion. If this were ever triggered, it would be problematic, and we would adjust it. Its intent is to prevent underfunding by local communities. It's a penalty meant to be a deterrent. And it has worked. So we looked at, we think the more draconian ones have the potential to harm children. Obviously, the less draconian ones, to your point, probably won't work. And so the commission is recommending following the lead of Connecticut, where they have not seen underfunding since implementing this. Really good question.
Most public housing in the state, way above what is supposed to be required of every community. And by the same token, if you look at the ads, some really, really high-value properties, it says assessed, not sale price, obviously. So you put those two together, we account, but again, you have to also account all those special needs too. So that's the whole point, because it says assessed value, because there's that image, upstate as we say, that it's such a rich community in some places.
Yeah,
And I think the commercial property also is pretty high too. And this should be able to tell our local municipal government that this has to be, like you say, equitable. And
Yeah.
that's the whole point. That's the point. Because if you're going to make it equitable, you have to be high for some and then average for the others.
The Rhode Island Foundation has worked with a legal team to draft the legislation that is in front of both houses right now. And I know that this is one of the, operationalizing this in a way that really reflects the intention of the recommendations is something that has been a major focus for them to ensure that, I'm not a lawyer, so my language is admittedly sloppy here. Like the law is much more precise. Or the bill is much more precise. The intent there is to directly reflect revenue raising ability. Not to punish people for having wealth, or for having poverty, but to accurately reflect truly what is the ability to pay, as demonstrated by the revenue that can be and is raised in the community.
From the different communities, so if they are contributing the per pupil cost, that's not equal.
Yes, so
That's why
that particular point is really in the weeds, so it's not in my presentation, but I'm happy to talk more about that. The commission's recommendations and the bill include a process for funding CTE that disincentivizes poaching of high cost or high spender kids. So does that make sense to folks? Like right now, there are superintendents facing existential crisis, right, who are looking to other communities and according, some believe, are looking to communities that pay higher per pupils to pull those kids into the district. That is unjust in so many ways, right? It's think about what the impact of the kids in those lower per pupil communities as well, who are not getting recruited to the best program. So much injustice in that system. The proposal recommends a kind of the creation of a program rate that where every community would pay the same amount to that, they would pay their amount to that program, and then the state would pick up the difference. So it's a small amount for the state, but it's meaningful for communities, and it would completely eliminate, there would be no benefit to getting a kid, from Cranston versus Pawtucket or wherever. I'm making those up based on per pupils.
How our local municipalities within our district pay is set by our regionalization legislation, and it does not match this. Because our two towns contribute by number of students, and it would not match this at all. So I'm wondering which would supersede which? Like, would our enabling documentation, our enabling legislation still rule how our towns contribute, or would it be this?
I don't know off the top of my head. I would need to look into that. We believe that this is feasible within that system, but you know things I don't know, so we can talk afterward.
All of the regional districts would have to, their enabling legislation documents would have to be looked at to see how they would work with this new statewide.
Yeah,
They won't match.
that is possible. Yeah, I'm not sure. And the legislation, to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure doesn't include anything about how when there's more than one municipality, how those municipalities share that cost, I think is kind of kicked down to you all. So I don't have a good answer to that question right now. Yeah.
I guess would we be breaking the law if we stick to our local law? And that's where it becomes a wolf. And again, all of the regional districts would have the same.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there would be a kind of like reconciliation of the laws. Yeah, this legislation impacts a bunch of other laws in many areas, and so there are a bunch of these crosswalks that I think the foundation could share with you if you're interested.
School districts be required to submit their proposed budgets to the state so that
I'm going to get to
amounts can be determined.
Yeah, hold on to the accountability question because that's coming. Great. Okay, so just to wrap up this piece on required local share, we use this slide to help people to understand the importance and significance of required local share. The funding formula at a very basic level does two things. It has two jobs. It determines what it costs to educate a child in a place, and then it determines how much the local community will pay of that and how much the state will pay of that. So how big is the bucket? How much is filled up by the state? How much is filled up by the local community? And currently, what you see is on the left-hand side. The funding formula determines what it costs to educate a child. We know that's really limited. That bucket should be bigger than what it is right now. That's not really the full amount. And then the state puts in their money, and the local community may or may not fill the bucket to the top. So some students within the state are fully funded, other students are not, using the same kind of calculations, all things equal. What we're suggesting, what the commission is recommending, is on the right, that the funding formulas still do the same two jobs. It determine more accurately what it costs to educate a child, and then insist upon the local share as determined by the real ability to raise revenue. And then the state fills the bucket every time. So all students, the rationale here is that all students are fully funded utilizing the same calculation for what it costs to educate children. Okay, the final recommendation is an acknowledgement that, and really a strong belief, I come from schools, and I'm also a parent, that investment in education is publicly accountable investment, and that students, families, taxpayers, and you all should demand transparency and strategic management of those funds that tie spending to educational outcomes. So right now we know district budgets are complex, opaque, sometimes not well managed. To overcome these challenges, the Commission proposes that districts receive more support in budgeting and financial planning from RIDE, that the Uniform Chart of Accounts, that's UCOA is are you all familiar with UCOA already? Okay, great. So UCOA is a great asset in our state. We're lucky this is better than in some other states, but it is not used consistently between districts in ways that make it difficult to know how funds are spent, even for researchers at Brown University, never mind for parents or students who want to see how their funding is being spent. And that districts continue to undergo periodic audits. As we know, the system rarely connects spending decisions to student outcomes today. Districts receive state aid regardless of their past spending, student outcomes, or financial transparency. The Commission's interest is that districts clearly connect spending to outcomes and publicly report progress to their stakeholders. So to a degree, this occurs already, and the Commission insists that this be a more formal annual process of public presentations linking spending to student outcomes, and then when that is not happening, to engage in strategic management efforts that reallocates resources. So this is not meant to replace the RIDE accountability system, but rather to say, if that funding was intended to improve this condition or outcome within your district and that's not happening, then what support does the district need to make that change? Toward that end, what we have right now is a system where there is absolutely no intervention until something catastrophic happens, and then the state takes over. That is not, as educators, we know that is not the way, right, to intervene when problems are arising. And so the commission recommends that districts receive ongoing support from RIDE. That's pretty light touch and really wouldn't feel much different to districts that are successful now. But those that are not meeting their goals would go through a system of collaborative planning, oversight, leading eventually to state control, rather than just hopping right to state control after really no helpful intervention. The commission talked at length about who would hold districts accountable for their fiscal responsibility, and was really did not believe that RIDE was the organization to do that within our state, and instead wanted to establish, as other states have done, a fiscal responsibility board that would provide tiered fiscal and strategic support for struggling districts. That would include a range of stakeholders and experts, including folks like yourselves. So in summary, the commission recommends a funding system that does four things: accounts for the full cost of education and shares those costs more equitably, tailors instructional costs to student needs more directly, ensures greater predictability for municipalities with a required local share, and requires transparency and strategic management that ties spending to educational outcomes. I'm going to pause, or really stop there today, and hear your questions and thoughts about this set of proposals. And just reminding you again that I really presented this at a very top level, and there is a lot of detail about these and other questions. That great CTE question was a good example of, I think, many of the other really helpful revisions within the legislation that we just don't get to here because there's so much to cover. When you go to the full report, at the very back of the full report, you'll see projections. So these are our best effort utilizing publicly available data. So you should not, these aren't the actuals, but projections where we modeled out the new system and compared it to the current system. So I think one of the things that you should bear in mind, though, when you do that, when you look, is that, remember that category, when we looked at that kind of T-chart, there was that category to the far left of things your district pays for that are not in the system, that we estimated that number for every district utilizing UCOA. So that means it's what you actually spent, but it also means it doesn't include everything because UCOA isn't perfect. And those numbers are quite large. In many districts, what you will see is an increase in the number that the local community would contribute as their contribution to the funding formula, right? Their percentage, their share, but a reduction to zero of those kind of unaccounted for costs. So that what I'm telling you is at the back, when you look at that long chart, you need to also remember that your out-of-district transportation, your high-cost special education, and your legacy teacher pension payments are out, and those are not reflected there. Okay. There would be one mechanism here within the funding system to say, hey, that money earmarked for ensuring you didn't have, big gaps, right, or high suspension, or whatever was the goal, isn't actually resulting in that, that would trigger the kind of tiered interventions that I shared. Great question. So they haven't fully operationalized what that fiscal responsibility board would look like quite yet, but the spirit of it is to be helpful and collaborative. It's built in the image of tiered supports for students, right? When we think about kids needing help, we put in place kind of preventative tiered partnership kind of relationships. So that is the spirit of it. And it was important to the commission that it not be RIDE, instead, not the state authorizing agency, right, but instead a group of people, including the kinds of stakeholders you're talking about.
Okay, so what categories of outcomes though?
Yeah, so the outcomes are grounded in the strategic plan of the district. So they're grounded in the strategic plan of the district. So whatever the district is saying they're trying to do with those funds, that's what they're looking at.
Are there other similar models that are in place like this? I'm thinking of bad examples of this where this is blown up with, like private funding models for schools, corporate models for running schools, things like that in the past. Like, are there other models based off of success in this? I mean, there's always that feeling of teaching to the test. You know what I mean? Like everything.
Yeah, I don't think that will. That's definitely not the spirit of it. I don't think that will happen. And I didn't need to learn more about how it resulted in corporate models.
When corporations started, not so much charter schools, but there were corporate models that they were like heavily on this teaching incentives for teachers. We're going to pay
Oh,
more
I see.
if you teach more. That's what it's reminding me of. And then it became this very much like I have some certain money, so I'm going to make sure my kids get the right test scores.
I see.
And it's cheap. There's a lot of that's the extreme example.
Yeah, that helps me to understand the concern. We do see this model across the country. The most prominent version of it is in California, but there are other models like this where, yeah, I mean, in California, it's really framed as a local. It's a accompaniment to a local control model. So in California, it's meant to preserve local autonomy over what the goals of the district actually are. And we heard that interest here in Rhode Island as well, that to the question before about, when the state takes over X or Y cost, are they also taking over decision making? That is something that the commission was really concerned about, and separating out, paying for it doesn't mean that you're the governance structure over it. I hear your concern. I think I would say inherent in any kind of accountability structure is the kind of incentive that you're talking about, but that is not the intent of this. In fact, it's intentionally divorced from the state accountability system, which is more directly related to those outcomes that you mentioned. Yes and no. I mean, we know in the background that there's the 4% cap. It's unclear if the 4% would be triggered in communities. We do not believe that it would be, because the vast majority, so we can model this out. Remember how I said before, there's no recommendation around amounts, right? So we can model this out and maintain the assumption that the state pays 58% of costs. So let's just say we do that. If we modeled it out that way, the state education budget would increase, and almost every municipal budget or municipal contribution in the state would go down. So for the vast majority of districts, there would be a lower cost for education for the municipality. So we don't see that as a big risk. If the legislature is the one that makes decisions about the total Rhode Island education budget. So if they decide that they are not going to continue to fund at 58%, which again, I think there's a lot of political reason that they should, that's about it's not ambitious, it's about middle of the road. If they fund below 58%, that would increase municipal costs. I think that's extremely unlikely, but I am not a political brain or advocate. I'm a research scientist, so I don't know how that will shake out. But if the commission's recommendations, and really I think the intent is for the state to maintain its contribution, if that occurs, municipalities would have less, not more, responsibility.
So on your projections that you put together so far, what that would look like, you're using taxable property and commercial property, and you're not looking at what the towns or cities may be charging in their tax rate now. Is that correct? You're
No.
excluding their tax rate?
We're not using individual municipal tax rates because the intent here is to treat every Rhode Island taxpayer exactly the same. That doesn't mean your tax rate would change. It just means the portion that goes to education would be exactly the same. So regardless of what town I live in, it would be the same. The local maintenance of effort right now has like really negative economic incentives involved in it. We heard districts, we heard folks in privately tell us that they were not putting forward budget increases for fear that they would be held to them in the future. We know that it's getting in the way of adequately funding children. It doesn't define it within the report, but it establishes the process for doing that using the state CTE board. There are already kind of cost projections that the CTE board is working with that they can employ for this purpose. And I think it's somewhat intuitive as well, yeah. It's by, yes, exactly. Exactly. So if you're running a culinary program and where many of those across the state, it would be the same across the state. It's not district specific. Whatever is allowed, if the system currently allows a student to leave the district now, that would not change, right? Again, this is perhaps a problem that we're not going to solve within the scope of this. However, we do think that we've removed the incentive for preferential poaching. So it's not going to prevent them from trying to get kids from other districts. But trying to get kids from high-paying districts, I think, is mitigated in this. There's no logic to it anymore. Yeah, so right now, the ability to pay is determined using an equation that includes a quadratic mean, which is just a mathematical calculation. It takes into account the taxable property value, as we're proposing here, but it kind of mitigates it with concentration of child poverty. So if you have a high wealth district, but also high poverty in the district, the contribution goes down. Within that current reality, some taxpayers are paying at a lower rate than others. And that was the intent of removing the quadratic mean. That's the main intent. The secondary, I guess close second intent, is to make the system more logical and transparent. Right now, it's really hard to know where those numbers came from. Instead, we want people to know this year, X amount, whatever it is, X rate is the rate that all taxpayers in Rhode Island are paying toward their schools, and that would be the same everywhere. It wouldn't be kind of discounted in communities with high poverty and high property wealth. So there are a few districts where that's the case, and a few of those are there are 4 municipalities where, according to our estimates, there could be larger municipal contribution. Those 4 places have that reality, including Newport, not surprisingly. If the commission's recommendations were passed into legislation, then 2 things would happen. We would acknowledge as a state that it costs more money to educate kids than what we're saying right now at the state level. And so I think that's the opposite direction of what you're concerned about. And it increased state contribution to public education. So if the legislation passes and it's funded the way the commission recommends, the vast majority of local communities, including yours, would see relief.
But there's 2 parts to it, though. They can agree to this, but then they can also say, and we're only going to give this much money.
I think that's, I'm not a politician or advocate, but I think that that's highly unlikely. The other piece that I should mention is that the foundation is urging the legislature to adopt the legislation now and to phase in the implementation over several years, around 3 to 4 years. That would allow for the state to continue to increase education budget at the current rate it's increasing and basically cover the increase. So the state of Rhode Island RIPEC says it's been increasing its state education budget by X% per year for the last decade. If that rate continues, the state would be able to absorb the difference in 3 to 4 years that the 58% would require. I don't know. I mean, I can't predict the future. I think implementation, implementation is always, I think people always feel the way you feel during kind of the prospect of change and implementation. But the status quo, I'll just reflect back what one of our superintendent, Janine Nadamasi, who's the Cranston superintendent, has sat on this board, reiterated many, many times, the status quo is unsustainable. And so I think that the change is going to have the opposite effect of what you're describing. That's its intent, but there is risk, you're right. It's always a feeling of risk with change.
So that's how much risk is there and how much are we, like the reality of, okay, yes, we need to get here, but what's the reality in the meantime? That's a very real.
I cannot imagine the state passing this and then not funding it. I can't imagine that.
Live in Rhode Island?
I do. Yeah. Yes, so the 4 communities that would see a higher contribution toward the local share are Westerly, Newport, Charahoe, and I believe Middletown. But that's all visible in the back of the report will show you that. In the back, you can see all of that. I want you to also keep in mind that kind of state-covered cost category that's not reflected. Because we used UCOA and it's an estimate and it relies upon every LEA's bookkeeping, we did not include it in the report. We just didn't feel the projections were solid enough. But every community would also lose the burden of high-cost special education, interdistrict transit, and legacy teacher pension debt. I think we're all done, Tim, unless there's anything you'd like to add as a member of the commission.
Part of the reason for that is if you take a look at the birth rate, it's been declining over the last decade. So Rhode Island's population is declining, and we'll probably lose a congressional seat after the next census. So that impacts schools. The question then becomes, how do you form alliances to deliver services on a more efficient basis? Now, one of the things that I constantly get asked is, why don't we just have a big regional school system? And that goes back to when Governor Sunland was the governor. Don Carcieri also broached that question. It's a constitutional issue. So we have representatives here from Bristol Warren. That was the last district to regionalize. It required a vote of the local communities because school districts, according to our Supreme Court, are part and parcel of municipal government. So until that changes, in order to have the legislature promote regionalization, it's subject to a local referendum. And in my experience, that doesn't work out that well. So Pawtucket and Central Falls tried to regionalize back in the 80s. That failed. Foster and Gloucester regionalized their middle school and their high school, but they still have 3 independent elementary schools, so they have 3 systems. And they've had referendum to regionalize, and that hasn't gone forward. Charahoe had 1 district that tried to separate itself from the regional format, the 3 districts there. So, I mean, it looks like common sense. Why don't we just have like 3 big school districts in the state? But there are constitutional issues that kind of inhibit that from happening. Just a few thoughts on high-cost special education. Again, I mentioned that the governor's proposal would go to 45% of the student success factor. That impacts the reimbursement rate for high-cost special education. So the reimbursement rate under 40%, which is 4 times the core instructional amount plus the student success factor, is about $70,000. If you move those numbers up, the unintended consequence is you increase the threshold before you get reimbursed for high-cost special education. Under the governor's current proposal, it would push it to over $90,000. And right now, he doesn't add any additional funding to reimburse districts for high-cost special education. So even under his existing proposal, it would have only been funded at 87% rate. So even if you hit that threshold, you're only going to get 87 cents on the dollar. If he doesn't increase the bottom line on that, then you're looking probably at something around 60 cents on the dollar. So it's consequential, and it not only impacts charter schools, because they don't take those kids. I think the reimbursement rate out of $17.5 million in fiscal '26, all of the charter schools combined, and the state schools, by the way, received a reimbursement rate of $33,000 total, all of them combined, out of $17.5 million. So they don't take those students, but about 18% of your per pupil costs are associated with special education. And it's the same thing with career pathways. Very few of the students that are taking advantage of career tech and moving to a different district bring along IEPs with them. So, I mean, it's a funding dilemma. And you could look at career tech as a zero-sum game if everybody was getting students from other districts, but some districts don't. Johnston notoriously exports students to the tune of $4.5 million annually in tuition. So it is a problem, but there are a couple of things that we can think about. One is the constitutional right to an education, which may have a better chance of passing the House this year with the change in leadership. It passed the Senate. The Senate totally endorsed it. It was unanimous. I was shocked. Everybody voted for it. Even people that aren't particularly fans of education voted for it. And it's now in the House. So we're going to be meeting with Speaker Blazejewski and Leader Kazarian and try to push that over the finish line. There are also two resolutions, one in the House, one in the Senate, to create a commission to look at sharing of services and regionalization services. And I know that I'm not a big charter school fan, the central office staff of a much larger school district. So you have to really think about how much we're expending on administrative overhead in a charter school that only serves 200, 300 students, but has replicated everything else that's included, a special ed coordinator, assistant superintendent, HR personnel. All of that is being replicated on a much smaller basis. So I think that's something that we can take a look at as well.